It was the summer of 1944. The fields of Normandy burned under the weight of war. Smoke rose from shattered villages, and the rumble of engines echoed through the hedgerows. American tank crews, young and terrified, crawled forward in their M4 Shermans, machines they both loved and hated. The Sherman tank was their steel coffin and their lifeline, their home and their executioner. German shells sliced through them like butter, and every tanker knew the odds. If a Panther spotted you first, you were as good as dead. Yet somehow, through all the destruction, through all the chaos, the Americans kept climbing into those so-called death traps. And strangely, they preferred them. When the Americans first faced the German Panther tank in combat, it was like meeting a monster born from industrial nightmares. The Panther was sleek, powerful, and terrifyingly efficient. Its 75mm high-velocity gun could tear through a Sherman from more than a mile away. Its sloped armor made incoming shells glance off like pebbles against stone. Every statistic screamed superiority: thicker armor, longer gun, greater range, faster on open ground. In contrast, the Sherman was a mass-produced box of compromises: thin armor, a short 75mm gun, and an engine that overheated in muddy terrain. On paper, there was no contest. But wars are not fought on paper. They are fought by men, in mud, fire, and fear, and in those conditions, the Sherman began to show why its crews stayed loyal. The first reason was reliability. The Sherman almost never broke down. It was simple, predictable, and forgiving, like an old friend that never left you stranded. A Panther, by contrast, was a temperamental diva. It demanded constant maintenance, delicate handling, and parts that were nearly impossible to replace in the field. Many Panthers never even made it to the front lines; they broke down on the way. In the chaos of battle, reliability became survival. Sherman crews could trust their tank to start every morning, to move when ordered, and to carry them out of hell when everything went wrong. The Panther might have been stronger, but it was also slower to repair, and when one failed, it often had to be abandoned. In a war that moved fast, that could mean life or death. Then there was numbers, the brutal arithmetic of war. The Americans understood that one Panther could destroy a Sherman in a head-on duel, but they also knew that 3 or 4 Shermans could surround, outflank, and destroy that same Panther from the sides or rear. The U.S. Army didn't believe in fighting fair. Their strategy was built on coordination, communication, and overwhelming presence. Each Sherman carried a radio, something most German tanks lacked early on, which meant they could coordinate movements, call artillery, or request air support in seconds. The Panthers often fought blind, relying on hand signals or pre-arranged plans that quickly fell apart once the battle turned chaotic. A single Panther might be a fortress, but 5 Shermans working together were a wolf pack, fast, cunning, and lethal. There was also visibility. Inside the Sherman, crew members had wide periscopes and a rotating turret that allowed them to spot targets faster. The Panther's optics were sharper, yes, but its field of vision was narrow. German tankers often complained that they couldn't see approaching threats until it was too late. In the split seconds that decided survival, that mattered. Many American crews reported that their ability to spot and react quickly often saved their lives before a Panther even fired. In Normandy's tight hedgerows and dense villages, it wasn't always about who had the better gun, it was about who saw who first. But the heart of the Sherman's strange appeal lay deeper, in psychology. American crews knew their tanks were vulnerable, yet they also knew how to use that vulnerability to their advantage. They learned to adapt. They would charge in pairs, one drawing fire while the other flanked. They would use smoke shells to mask movements, or call in fighter bombers when they encountered heavy opposition. The Sherman wasn't a machine of brute force, it was a weapon of teamwork. Its crews became clever hunters in fragile cages, relying not just on their tank's mechanics but on their coordination and courage. They transformed fear into strategy, and that transformation made them deadly. Even when American tankers got their hands on captured Panthers, the admiration didn't last long. The first thing they noticed was how complex the German machines were. Everything inside was tightly packed, mechanical, and heavy. The transmissions were fragile, the engines overheated quickly, and spare parts were impossible to find. A Sherman could be repaired with a wrench, a hammer, and a bit of improvisation. A Panther needed a factory. American mechanics joked that if a Panther threw a track, you might as well dig a hole and bury it. In a war that demanded speed, simplicity beat sophistication. The Sherman's design philosophy was rooted in practicality. It wasn't meant to win one-on-one duels, it was meant to win the war. Every part was built for mass production, transport, and maintenance. Shermans could be shipped across oceans, assembled in days, and repaired in hours. Factories back home churned out thousands every month, while Germany struggled to replace each destroyed Panther. For every Panther that rolled onto the battlefield, 5 new Shermans arrived to meet it. And behind those Shermans came the lifeblood of American logistics: fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, field mechanics, and radio networks, an entire ecosystem designed to keep the war machine alive. The German crews, meanwhile, were trapped by their own engineering brilliance. The Panther was too expensive, too delicate, and too late. By 1944, Germany was running out of everything: oil, steel, manpower. Their tanks were masterpieces, but they were dying relics of a perfectionist ideology. The Sherman, by contrast, was imperfect by design, and that made it unstoppable. American generals understood that winning wars wasn't about having the best weapon, it was about having enough weapons that worked every single day. And then there was something intangible, the bond between man and machine. Sherman crews gave their tanks nicknames: Thunderbolt, Death Dealer, Honey, Lucky Lady. They painted them with symbols, jokes, and personal markings. These weren't just vehicles, they were partners. Every scratch told a story, every dent carried a memory. Many tankers described their Shermans as having personalities, some stubborn, some reliable, some lucky. The Panther, though impressive, never earned that same affection. It was cold, mechanical, alien. For American tankers, the Sherman felt human. It was flawed, yes, but so were they, and together, they survived. By late 1944, the Allies had learned to fight smarter. Shermans were upgraded with better guns, the 76mm, the GZ-8 models, and equipped with better armor and new ammunition types. They were still no match for a Panther in a straight duel, but they didn't need to be. The Americans had perfected combined arms warfare. When a Sherman spotted a Panther, it didn't fight alone. Infantry would flank with bazookas. Artillery would rain smoke and fire. P-47 Thunderbolts screamed overhead with rockets. A Panther might destroy a few Shermans, but eventually, it would fall. The Sherman had become a cog in a vast, deadly machine, and that machine never stopped moving. Looking back, historians often debate whether the Sherman was truly a death trap or whether that label was unfair. Its armor was thin, yes. Its ammunition could ignite, yes. But the reality is that every tank was vulnerable in World War II. Panthers burned just as easily when hit by Allied shells. The difference was, the Sherman gave its crews a chance to fight another day, to repair, to return. In war, consistency matters more than perfection. That's why the American tankers, despite all their curses and complaints, kept choosing their Shermans. They didn't choose it because it was the strongest. They chose it because it was the one that stayed with them. The secret behind the Sherman's survival wasn't hidden in its armor or its gun, it was hidden in its system. Behind every Sherman that rumbled across the fields of France, there was an invisible army: engineers, mechanics, truck drivers, and factory workers. The true genius of the Sherman wasn't that it was better, it was that it was everywhere. It never stopped coming. Like an industrial tide, the Sherman rolled out of American factories day and night, crossing oceans, scaling beaches, and rolling through towns that only months earlier had been enemy strongholds. It was a living symbol of American power, not just in steel, but in organization, logistics, and will. By mid-1944, America was producing nearly 2,000 Sherman tanks every month. German intelligence couldn't believe the numbers. They thought it was impossible. Each Panther that rolled off the assembly line in Germany required enormous effort, precision tooling, and rare materials, molybdenum, high-grade steel, skilled labor. The Sherman, by contrast, was the embodiment of mass production. Its components were standardized across hundreds of factories. A transmission made in Michigan could fit perfectly into a hull made in Pennsylvania or a turret cast in Illinois. Everything was interchangeable. That meant if a Sherman broke down in the field, a mechanic could pull a part off a destroyed one nearby and have it running again in hours. It was the tank version of the American automobile industry, and it worked with breathtaking efficiency. Germany, on the other hand, was collapsing under the weight of its own engineering pride. The Panther, though magnificent, was a nightmare to maintain. Its final drive, a critical gearbox that transferred power to the tracks, often broke after only 100 kilometers. Its engines overheated easily, especially in dusty or muddy conditions. Even when the Panther wasn't destroyed by enemy fire, it was often immobilized by its own complexity. Crews abandoned them not because they feared battle, but because they couldn't fix them. Spare parts were scarce, and repair crews were overwhelmed. When an American Sherman broke, it was fixed overnight. When a Panther broke, it might be lost forever. That reliability gave the Sherman crews something priceless: momentum. In modern warfare, speed kills. The faster an army can move, the faster it can win. After the breakout from Normandy, American armored divisions began advancing with a ferocity the Germans couldn't match. While Panthers sat broken in muddy fields waiting for spare parts that would never arrive, Shermans thundered eastward, covering miles every day. Town after town fell to the relentless American advance. The German commanders couldn't understand it. How could such inferior tanks move so fast, appear everywhere, and keep fighting without rest? The answer was simple: the Sherman didn't sleep. That mobility also changed how wars were fought. American generals like George S. Patton understood this perfectly. Patton wasn't interested in dueling German tanks head-on. He was interested in breaking through, surrounding, and outmaneuvering the enemy. He used the Sherman as a tool of mobility, a spear point that could strike deep and fast. When Patton's Third Army swept across France in late 1944, his Shermans often advanced faster than fuel could reach them. German commanders tried to block the roads with Panthers, but they couldn't stop the tide. The Panther was a hunter, but it was heavy, rigid, and tied to fixed defenses. The Sherman was a pack animal, lighter, faster, and able to go wherever it was needed. One American tanker described it best. The Panther could kill us from 1,000 yards. But it couldn't stop us from coming. But the Sherman's true power wasn't only in movement, it was in communication. Every Sherman carried a radio, and that changed everything. The crews could talk to each other, to infantry units, and to air support in real time. They could coordinate ambushes, request artillery fire, or call in airstrikes within minutes. The Germans, by comparison, were often fighting blind. Only the commander's tank in a Panther platoon had a radio. The rest relied on flags, flares, or shouted commands, hopelessly outdated methods in a war moving at lightning speed. In those few seconds of confusion, the Americans would already be flanking, repositioning, or retreating to safety. The radio turned the Sherman from a single machine into part of a massive, intelligent organism. Entire armored battalions could move as one, reacting instantly to battlefield changes. This technological edge gave the Americans flexibility, a quality the German war machine, bound by rigid doctrine and centralized control, lacked. The Panther may have been stronger, but the Sherman was smarter. And in modern warfare, intelligence wins more battles than armor. Then came air power, the Sherman's best friend. American tank crews knew that if they encountered a Panther or a Tiger, they could hold the line, mark the target, and let the sky do the rest. P-47 Thunderbolts, Typhoons, and Mustangs roared overhead, turning German armor columns into flaming wrecks. This cooperation between air and ground forces, a key feature of Allied warfare, gave the Sherman crews enormous confidence. They didn't have to win every tank duel. They just had to survive long enough for the cavalry above to arrive. Meanwhile, the Germans had no such luxury. Their skies belonged to the enemy. A Panther crew might win one battle, but by afternoon, Allied aircraft would swoop in and destroy them before they could retreat. This imbalance turned every German victory into a temporary one. And the Sherman, with its radio and mobility, became the perfect ground partner for the skies. American tankers learned to fight with one eye on the ground and the other on the clouds. That coordination made them unstoppable. But perhaps the most important factor was crew training. American tankers were trained not just to drive and shoot, but to think. They were encouraged to make decisions in the field, to improvise, to adapt. German training was excellent, but it was rigid. Tankers were expected to follow orders, not invent new tactics. As the war dragged on and veteran crews were lost, the Germans struggled to replace them with equally skilled men. The Americans, however, could train thousands of new tankers every month, all familiar with the Sherman's simple design. New crews could be inserted into battle quickly, confident they knew how their machines worked. That simplicity meant survival. A Sherman's controls were intuitive, its systems easy to understand. If a driver was killed, another crew member could take his place. In the Panther, that was nearly impossible. Everything was specialized, complicated, and cramped. Many captured Panther crews complained that their tanks were not built for men, but for engineers. The Sherman, however, was built for soldiers. And soldiers learned to love it. As the war entered its final months, that love turned into loyalty. Tankers began writing letters home, praising their old reliable Sherman. Some admitted they cursed it at first, but by the end, they realized it had saved them more times than they could count. In one letter found after the war, a sergeant wrote, "I'd rather fight in my Sherman any day. She starts when I ask, moves when I tell her, and brings me back alive. That's all that matters." And it wasn't just words. Data from the war showed that while Shermans were destroyed in large numbers, their crews often survived. The Sherman's interior was designed with escape hatches and fire extinguishers, allowing crews to bail out quickly if hit. Panthers, in contrast, were notorious for trapping their crews when penetrated. Many German tankers died not from enemy fire, but from being unable to escape burning machines. The Sherman gave its men a fighting chance to live. That was worth more than any extra inch of armor. When American forces pushed into Germany in 1945, they began encountering more abandoned Panthers than destroyed ones. Some were stuck in ditches, others burned out due to engine fires, and many were left without fuel. Sherman crews would drive past, laughing grimly at the irony, that a superior, tanks that had become nothing more than wrecks on the roadside. The Sherman, meanwhile, just kept going. It crossed rivers, climbed mountains, and rolled into Berlin's outskirts. The so-called death trap had outlived its predators. Behind this triumph lay the full weight of American industry. Factories like Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal were operating 24 hours a day, churning out tanks faster than Germany could destroy them. Women worked assembly lines, welders spark-flooded the air, and convoys of brand-new Shermans rolled out every morning. When one burned, another replaced it within days. It was warfare as mathematics, and the math was unbeatable. To the German engineers, this was sacrilege. They had built the Panther as a masterpiece of precision. But war doesn't reward beauty, it rewards persistence. The Sherman was crude, maybe even ugly, but it didn't break, it didn't stall, and it didn't stop. Its heart, a gasoline engine designed for trucks, might have been simple, but it kept beating through snow, mud, and shellfire. That stubborn heartbeat carried the Allies across Europe. As one German officer later admitted, the Americans could afford to lose tanks. We could not afford to lose time. And that, in the end, was the difference. The Sherman wasn't a miracle weapon. It was a workhorse, a piece of industrial poetry that moved, fought, and endured. The Americans didn't worship it, they used it. They used it relentlessly, strategically, and intelligently. Each one was a small piece of a giant puzzle that stretched from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin. It wasn't perfection that won the war, it was production, cooperation, and belief in the system. The Panther may have been the better tank, but the Sherman was part of the better machine. It was the machine that never slept, never stopped, and never gave up. And in the final months of the war, that unstoppable machine rolled right over the ruins of the Reich. War has a way of turning machines into memories. To an outsider, a Sherman tank was just a noisy, smoking, steel monster that rolled through mud and fire. But to the men inside it, the driver, the gunner, the loader, the commander, and the assistant driver, it was more than just armor and rivets. It was home. It was a heartbeat of 5 men beating as one. The outside world called it a death trap. The men inside called it her. Every Sherman crew had its own story, its own scars. Inside those cramped, suffocating walls, the crew became a family. The smell of grease, gasoline, and gunpowder mixed with sweat and fear. They slept on the floor plates, ate canned rations beside the turret, and wrote letters home on the same steel that could become their tomb. Yet they joked, laughed, and dreamed, because humor was the only armor stronger than steel. They knew their chances were slim. They knew a single Panther shell could slice through their hull like paper. But they also knew something the world often forgot: a tank is only as alive as the men inside it. One of the most famous Sherman stories came from Normandy. A young crew from the 2nd Armored Division, led by Sergeant William Bill Hartman, was sent to clear a small French village near Saint-Lô. As they rolled in, they heard the growl of a Panther's engine echoing through the streets. The air froze. Every man in the Sherman knew what that sound meant. It was the sound of death approaching. The Panther opened fire first, its 75mm round smashed through a stone wall, sending debris flying across the narrow street. Hartman shouted orders as the driver slammed the Sherman into reverse, tracks screeching on cobblestones. The first shell missed them by inches. The second hit their left track and tore it apart, immobilizing them. Smoke filled the cabin. But instead of abandoning the tank, the crew stayed inside. The gunner, coughing and half-blind from the dust, aimed the Sherman's shorter 75mm gun and fired. The round bounced harmlessly off the Panther's front armor. Hit him again. Hartman yelled. They switched to high-explosive shells, targeting the building beside the Panther. The explosion sent rubble collapsing onto the German tank, forcing it to back away. In that brief window, American infantry with bazookas rushed forward and fired. The Panther erupted in flames. That night, Hartman's crew sat on their burned, broken Sherman, drinking coffee from tin cups. Their tank was wrecked, but they were alive. That's why we love her, Hartman wrote later. She took the hit so we didn't have to. Stories like that echoed across Europe. The Sherman wasn't feared for its armor or gun, it was respected for its forgiveness. When hit, it didn't always explode instantly. The armor might deform, catch fire, or buckle, but the crew often survived. The tank was designed with escape routes and quick-release hatches. Many American tankers owed their lives to those design choices. They might crawl out of a burning wreck covered in soot and fear, but they lived to fight again. In contrast, German tanks, especially the Panther and Tiger, were harder to escape from due to tight interiors and complex locking mechanisms. Many German crews died trapped in their own perfection. That survival rate built something powerful: trust. Sherman crews began to believe that their tank, flawed as it was, would bring them home. They gave it names, painted it with slogans, and treated it like a comrade. You could walk through an American tank depot and see Shermans with names like Sweetheart Sue, Hell's Fire, Lucky Bastard, and the Widowmaker. Each one carried the spirit of the men inside it. Even when destroyed, those names would live on, often repainted onto the next tank they received. It was their way of saying, "We're still here." Behind the front lines, mechanics worked like surgeons. They patched bullet holes, welded armor plates, replaced turrets, and sent the same tank back into battle within days. Crews would return to find their old Sherman alive again, scarred but stronger. It created a strange kind of immortality, as if the machines themselves refused to die. The Panther might win a duel, but it could not outlive the Sherman's soul. Yet the legend of the death trap was born from real suffering. In the early months of 1944, before upgrades like wet ammunition storage and improved armor, Sherman tanks did indeed burn easily. The high-octane gasoline used by their engines could ignite when penetrated, turning the tank into a fiery coffin. Crews called it the Ronson, after a popular lighter brand, lights every time. That phrase haunted the Sherman's reputation forever. German propaganda spread it gleefully, portraying American tanks as fragile toys crushed by superior German engineering. But as the war continued, reality told a different story. Studies after 1944 showed that the Sherman's fire rate was not much higher than that of the Panther or Tiger once improvements were made. The death trap myth became a mix of early fear, German boasting, and the raw trauma of combat. After all, when a Sherman was hit and burned, it did so in front of everyone, its thin armor made every loss visible. A Panther might burn less often, but when it did, its crew rarely escaped to tell the tale. The Sherman burned brighter, but it also saved more men. American crews adapted quickly. They learned to use terrain, speed, and teamwork to outsmart the Panthers. Instead of charging head-on, they used flanking maneuvers, bait attacks, and ambush tactics. They would send one Sherman to draw fire, while another crept around the side to strike the Panther's weaker rear armor. Some units even used smoke shells to confuse the enemy, buying precious seconds to reposition. In open fields, they called in artillery or air strikes. By late 1944, Sherman crews had turned survival into an art form. What outsiders saw as cowardice, avoiding direct fights with German tanks, was in fact genius. The Americans understood that fighting smart mattered more than fighting bravely. A Panther might be deadly in a duel, but it couldn't match the Sherman's coordination. When 4 Shermans worked together, they could overwhelm even the best German tank crew. It was chess, not boxing. The emotional bond between crews and their tanks deepened as the war dragged on. In the bitter cold of the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, Sherman crews fought not only the Germans but also the freezing temperatures. Engines froze overnight, fuel thickened, and steel became brittle. Yet every morning, crews would climb inside, knock the frost off their controls, and coax the engine to life. The sound of that engine, rough, uneven, but alive, became a promise, "We're still in this." Letters home often revealed the strange affection soldiers had for their Shermans. One tanker wrote, "She's ugly, she's loud, she leaks oil, and she smells like death. But she's my girl. And she gets me out of hell every time." Another wrote after his 5th tank was destroyed, "I've lost more tanks than I can count, but I've never lost my crew. That's why I'll take a Sherman over a Panther any day." The Germans, meanwhile, faced a different kind of heartbreak. Panther crews watched as their mighty machines failed them again and again. Many Panthers were abandoned not because of enemy action, but because they simply broke down. Without fuel, without parts, and without air cover, the mighty beasts became useless hulks. German tankers often envied the Americans, not for their tanks, but for their system. They could see the endless convoys of spare parts, mechanics, and reinforcements rolling behind the Sherman units. The Panther might have been superior, but it fought alone. The Sherman was never alone. That difference, community versus isolation, defined the emotional core of the war. The Sherman wasn't a tank, it was part of a brotherhood. Each crew was connected not just to each other, but to an entire army of support. They knew that if they were hit, someone would come for them. If their tank burned, another would be waiting. If they were wounded, medics would find them. That belief gave them courage, the kind that outlasted fear. In the final months of the war, as the Allies advanced into Germany, that courage became defiance. Sherman crews faced desperate resistance from German armor divisions. Panthers hid in forests, ambushing convoys from the shadows. But the Americans didn't slow down. They learned to read the land, to expect the ambush, to fight with instinct rather than fear. Every battle was a test of nerves, and every victory was a tribute to endurance. One haunting story came from the crossing of the Rhine. A Sherman unit under Captain Joseph Lindell was ambushed by Panthers hidden along a ridge. Within minutes, 3 Shermans were hit and burning. Lindell's tank was the last one standing. His crew was terrified, they could see the muzzle flashes of the Panthers firing. Instead of retreating, Lindell ordered smoke shells and maneuvered forward through the fog. The crew fired blindly toward the ridge, their shells bursting near the German line. When the smoke cleared, they saw one Panther on fire and another retreating. They had survived. Lindell's Sherman was later found riddled with holes, but still running. Moments like that became legend among tank crews. The Sherman was no longer a death trap. It was a survivor's chariot, beaten, battered, but unbroken. When the war finally ended, and tankers returned home, they remembered their machines with a strange tenderness. Many visited military scrapyards years later, just to see the tanks that had carried them through hell. They would stand in silence, hands on cold steel, remembering the days when that metal had been alive. The Panther, for all its brilliance, disappeared into museums and history books. The Sherman, meanwhile, rolled on. It served in Korea, in Israel, in countless conflicts around the world. Decades after the war, it was still fighting, proof that simplicity and reliability outlast genius and pride. In the end, the truth was simple. American tankers didn't love the Sherman because it was safe. They loved it because it was faithful. It gave them something to believe in when the world was falling apart. It carried them through mud, fear, and fire, and brought them home. We called her a death trap, one veteran said years later, but she kept us alive long enough to call her that. The war was ending, but the Sherman wasn't done. Across the ruins of Europe, through the forests of the Ardennes and the shattered streets of Cologne, the same familiar silhouette rolled forward, squat, rounded, defiant. The M4 Sherman had carried the Allied star from the beaches of Normandy to the gates of Berlin, and now it stood as both a symbol of survival and of overwhelming industrial power. What began as a so-called death trap had become the face of liberation. By early 1945, the German armored divisions were shadows of what they once were. The mighty Panthers and Tigers, those towering beasts that had once terrified entire Allied columns, now lay abandoned by the roadside, out of fuel or broken beyond repair. Many never fired a shot in the final battles, they simply sat and rusted where their engines had failed. But the Shermans kept moving. They were battered, scratched, and patched with steel plates welded in field workshops, but they still roared to life each morning. In the end, it wasn't the strongest or the most advanced tank that reached victory, it was the one that endured. For American tankers, that victory was bittersweet. They had lost friends, entire crews, and countless machines. But when the guns finally fell silent, they looked at their Shermans not with hatred, but with pride. Those tanks had taken them across rivers, through burning towns, over minefields, and into the heart of the Reich itself. They weren't perfect, far from it, but they were enough. The Sherman had done exactly what it was designed to do, win the war, not a duel. Even German commanders, in their post-war reflections, admitted the truth. General Heinz Guderian, the father of the German Panzer Corps, later remarked that the Allies had mastered the art of practical warfare. He said, "The Americans understood that quantity has a quality all its own." The Sherman was that philosophy in steel form, not a masterpiece, but a miracle of logistics and consistency. It proved that wars are won not by the best weapon, but by the weapon that shows up, again and again. When the Allies finally marched into Germany, the Sherman became a rolling monument of liberation. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, villagers cheered as columns of Shermans rumbled through the streets, covered in mud and victory slogans. Children climbed onto their hulls to wave flags. To them, those tanks weren't death traps, they were symbols of freedom. Yet for the men who fought inside them, the memory was heavier. They remembered the smell of burning gasoline, the sound of shells ricocheting off armor, the scream of engines pushed beyond their limits. They remembered the faces of friends who didn't make it out. Every scratch on the steel had a name, a story, a ghost. And yet, they also remembered the feeling of survival, the moment when the engine finally caught after a near miss, or when the shell bounced off instead of breaking through. Those moments became sacred. They proved that the Sherman, despite all odds, gave them life. After the war, military historians began to ask the same question you're asking today: why did the Americans keep using such a flawed tank? Why didn't they replace it with something stronger, something equal to the Panther or the Tiger? The answer lies in the core of American strategy, and in the soul of the Sherman itself. The Sherman wasn't just a machine, it was a philosophy. It was the physical embodiment of a belief that wars are won not by the strongest, but by the most adaptable. America had learned a brutal truth from World War I: over-engineering kills speed. The Germans, obsessed with perfection, repeated that mistake. The Panther was an engineer's dream, but a soldier's nightmare. The Sherman was the opposite, a soldier's tank, designed for the realities of mud, chaos, and constant motion. And when peace returned, the Sherman kept rolling. Instead of being scrapped, thousands were refurbished and sent across the world. They served in the Korean War, in the Middle East, in Africa, and in South America. Nations rebuilt their armies using surplus Shermans, and some even upgraded them with modern guns and armor. The same tank that had once faced the Panther in Europe was now fighting new battles under new flags, proof that its design was timeless. In Israel's 1967 Six-Day War, heavily modified Shermans, known as Super Shermans, faced off against newer Soviet-made tanks and still held their ground. In India, Pakistan, Argentina, and dozens of other countries, the Sherman fought long after the Panther had vanished from the battlefield. The Panther's story ended in 1945. The Sherman's story never really ended. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. The inferior tank outlived the superior one by decades. Because the Sherman was never meant to be perfect, it was meant to last.